Hi, I'm Tim Landwehr from Tight Lines Fly Fishing Company, and I'm your host today on Midwest Sportsman. Today we're down in the Spring Creeks of southwest Wisconsin. Very, very diverse fishery as far as, an amazing trout fishery is what I'm getting at, I suppose. But what I want to talk about today is kind of what do these fish eat? What do these fish eat all season long, from January all through the summer? Where do they live and how do we find them? The rivers are very, very rich in insect life, and what I'd like to do today is kind of show you all the different insects that live in the river, maybe compare some of the flies that I have in my box when I'm down here and what I'm using to actually fish for these fish, and give you a better understanding of how to find them. We're going to break down throughout this episode riffle, run, and pool, which is the basic fundamentals of where fish live, and I want to show you that today. Here we are in the river, and what we're standing in right here is really kind of a conveyor belt or a buffet line for the trout. This is referred to as a riffle, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But it's a lot of broken water. This is where a lot of insects are living in the river system, are going to get washed downstream and will become prey for trout. But let's just kind of take a look here at some of the rocks and what lives actually in the river itself. If I just grab a rock here, here we go. If I grab a rock here, look at some of the stuff that I'm finding. This particular fly right here, this insect is a stonefly. And a stonefly lives in highly oxygenated water, much like what we're standing in here. Gets to be pretty good size like you see here, and depending on which particular stonefly it is, may have a life cycle from 1 year to 4 years for some of the giant stoneflies. But that is a big chunk of meat for a trout. You know, this is a T-bone for a trout. You know, and in our spring creeks, we do have stoneflies. It's not the prevalent food organism in our rivers, though. But almost every rock that you overturn, you're going to find stuff like this on it. There's another thing that I do have in my hand as well that, you know, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about, but it's a fly that's called a caddis larva. It's a free-living caddis larva, and I'll try to open him up a little so you guys can get a little better look at him. There he is. Free-living caddis larva or a green rockworm or something like this. These are scattered all over the river bottom. And right now, this is a very, very important food organism for the trout. A little later, we're going to show you actually tying one and maybe fishing one of these. But what is in this river system, I'll put him back. What's in this river system is a buffet line. And the spring creeks are so special because they are packed full of nutrients and packed full of bugs that these fish are going to eat. Now what I'm going to do is, you guys have seen me turn over some rocks, get an idea of some of the bugs. What I want to do for you is I'm going to collect a mayfly nymph, a caddisfly nymph, and maybe a stonefly nymph, and we're going to do a little comparison with the flies that I might carry on the river. What would I use to fish after I've come down to the river, rolled a couple rocks? Where would I start? What would I use? And I'm going to show you some different flies and compare those. Now here are the different insects that, you know, just from rolling a couple of rocks that are important, you know, especially on the spring creeks to a trout fisherman. If we take a look, you know, I showed you earlier the little caddis larva, which we have here. We have what's called a mayfly nymph, or this mayfly nymph in particular is the blue-winged olive, which is incredibly, incredibly important on our spring creeks. And also, if you notice, there are two blue-winged olives, same size, but if you notice, this one is a little bit darker. Right now, we are at the time of the year when these insects are hatching. And this darker one is ready to come out of its nymphal shuck and turn into an adult mayfly. I mean, this fly is going to hatch this afternoon. So these, we've got caddis, we've got some mayflies. Not all mayflies are going to look like this. You can see here's a little bigger crawling variety of a mayfly. We have a stonefly, and we have a scud, that freshwater shrimp. And we also have something that's incredibly important, is the midge. This is a midge larva. And midge larvae, they're very, very small, but they're in these rivers by the millions. So trout make their living a lot of times off of small insects like these. Now these are all subsurface insects that all have an adult life cycle other than this little scud. So all of these will live in our river systems for at least a year, and will swim to the surface or migrate to the shore and hatch and become the winged adult. And a lot of times that's what's referred to as a hatch. And we can catch trout on those. but there's so many different insects that live in the river, and this is an enjoyable part for me as an angler, kind of figuring out exactly what's in our rivers. Now, you don't have to be an entomologist to say, well, these are Baetis, and exactly what insects are what. They're Latin names. But what you do have to know as an angler, regardless of what your experience level on these rivers is, you need to be able to match their silhouette, their size, and their color. You don't have to know exactly what they are, what species they are. But if we take a look, I'm going to grab a couple of different flies from my own boxes, and we'll just kind of match them up. This little caddis larva right here, I would use a fly that would be called a caddis larva. Go figure. Can you see how closely that represents its adult? That stonefly, I could use something just kind of reminiscent of that stonefly. Maybe a prince nymph like this would work well for that. The scud, grab one of those guys. The scud is another important insect, and like I said, the thing about the scud is these fish make their living off of scuds. There's an awful lot of them down here. So if we take a look there, there's a good representation. Can you see what I mean about the size and the silhouette? Color is number 3. Size and silhouette are the most important. And then that little midge, this is the one that shocks most people. How can a fish see that? But I mean, we've caught 20-inch browns out of these rivers, fishing little flies like that. But there's the original, there's the imitation. And then these little blue-winged olive nymphs that you see here. It's a little Baetis nymph or little blue-winged olive nymph to kind of represent that. But the most important thing is that you're matching its size, you're matching its silhouette, and you're matching its color afterwards. But the rivers are full of these, and you can see how close we can represent these with artificial flies. And this is what is referred to as matching the hatch. Now, there is an opposite end of that. There are some different attractor flies that are important. And there's one in particular that's very, very common in this area. This is courtesy of John Bethke. He created a fly called a pink squirrel. The pink squirrel looks absolutely nothing like anything on this little box. But for some reason, time in and time out in the early season, that fly catches fish. This is what we would refer to as an attractor fly. It doesn't necessarily represent an exact replica of anything in the river, but it looks foodie, I guess. You and I can simply look at, if we're curious about something, I can walk over, I can pick it up and examine it and say, well, that's interesting, and set it back down. A trout doesn't have hands. He can't do that. So the only way he can analyze something is physically picking it up with his mouth. And sometimes attractor patterns like this are very, very effective. So this is a good place to start as far as flies go on the spring creeks. I wouldn't be without the flies that you see on this little plate. So let's head back to the river. We're going to kind of take a look at how the river's constructed, where these bugs are going to live, and where are those trout going to live, and how do we fish it.